Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. I'm Matthew Silverman, the director of the Haberman Institute for Jewish Studies, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to our program titled Truman and Israel, the behind-the-scenes story of U.S. support for statehood in 1948, with Professor Robert Watson. As I'm sure you all know, tonight begins Yom HaAtzmaut, Israel Independence Day, and I'm interested to learn with Dr. Watson as he discusses President Truman's support for the state of Israel, along with some of the behind the scenes challenges, decisions, and relationships. Thank you to Deva Berkman for sponsoring this program and being a longtime supporter of the Institute. I would also like to thank Bethel Hebrew Congregation and Agudas Achim Congregation, both in Alexandria, Virginia, for helping bring this lecture to our community. My usual logistical note, if you have any questions during the presentation, please click on the Q&A button on your Zoom screen. They will be discussed at the end of the lecture. And I now welcome Art Hessel, the Haberman Institute Board Vice President, who will introduce our speaker. Welcome, Art.
Thanks, Matt. I want to welcome everybody to the Haberman Institute and to tonight's lecture. As Matt said, it is called Truman and Israel, the behind-the-scenes story of U.S. support for statehood in 1948. Our presenter is Dr. Robert Watson. I'm the vice president of the Haberman Institute for Jewish Studies, and I'm happy to say that over 350 people have registered for this program. For those of you who might be new to Haberman, we're glad you're here with us. And you should know that our mission is to provide high-quality adult education through in-depth encounters with Jewish thought, history, and culture. If that's what you're looking for, you are in the right place. And I want to repeat Matt's thanks to Deva Berkman, my good friend, for sponsoring tonight's talk. Deva is benefiting us tonight in two ways. First, for her financial assistance, which enables us to present programs such as this. And secondly, because it was she who introduced us to and recommended Dr. Watson, tonight's presenter. And again, thanks to our two partner congregations, Agudas Achim and Bethel Hebrew, for joining with us tonight. We invite you to learn more about our programs and classes, as well as how to become a sponsor yourself, by visiting our website, habermaninstitute.org, pretty simple. And you'll see when you go there that there's a lot coming up. There are 7 programs listed for the month of May alone. I'm just going to call your attention to 2 of them next week. A week from tonight, on May 2nd, Jewish Theological Seminary Assistant Professor Sarah Wolf will be speaking on jealousy and gender in ancient Jewish law. And on Wednesday morning next week, May 3rd, a new class begins, the first of 4 sessions on the literature of Amos Oz. And now to this evening. Dr. Robert Watson is the Distinguished Professor of American History, the Avron Fogelman Research Professor, and the director of Project Civitas at Lynn University in Boca Raton, Florida. He's an award-winning author who somehow has published over 45 books and still has had time to write more than 200 scholarly articles and essays which have been published, as well as a 2 multi-edition encyclopedia set on the presidents and their first ladies. Dr. Watson's books have won him numerous prizes, including both the Independent Publishers Gold Medal Award and Silver Medal Award, the Commodore John Berry Book Award, and the John Lyman Book Award. He's a frequent media commentator. He's been a visiting scholar at dozens of historic sites. He's the co-founder of the annual Truman Legacy Symposium at the Truman Presidential Library in Independence. He's been voted Professor of the Year at both Florida Atlantic University and at Lynn, and has a large social media following. Finally, as Matt said, and as you know, this is a special day in Israel. It's Yom Ha'atzmaut, Israel's Independence Day, the 5th of Iyar. And today, by the Jewish calendar, the state of Israel is 75 years old. And although like here in the United States, there are important questions about what the future of Israel may hold, who would have thought 75 years ago, when the land of Israel held about 800,000 people, that one day it would hold 10 million? And who would have thought that the little desert town of Tel Aviv would one day, with its environs, house 50 skyscrapers of at least 40 stories and have more than 20 more under construction, and that Israel would be one of the world's leaders in technology? But it's only fitting that tonight our program is going to concentrate on what happened not today, but 75 years ago, on the day the state of Israel became. And not only what was happening there, but what was happening here, leading this country to be the first to recognize the new country. What could be more appropriate? Therefore, with excitement, with appreciation, Dr. Watson, everything is now turned over to you.
Thank you, Art. You know, they sometimes say that occasionally the introduction is better than the speech, and I think tonight might be one of those. That's a nice way to put it with regard to Tel Aviv. I'm delighted that in just a couple of weeks, I'm headed back to Israel as part of the 75th anniversary celebration. So looking forward to getting back, and honored Matthew, Becky, Art, all of you, and my good friend Dava. Honored to be with you on this special occasion to talk about one of my favorite topics, and my hero, by the way, Harry Truman, big Harry Truman fan. Let me share the screen and let's jump right into this. There we go, and boom, share the screen. Should all see that okay? Let me, there we go. We'll move it down to the next slide so you don't have to look at the landing slide. All right, so to get started with this, you know, I find that as a professor for 32 years now, and I've taught at a number of universities around the country, and as you heard in Art's introduction, I frequently serve as a visiting fellow or scholar at historical sites, museums, and so forth around the country. I find that the students get cynical about leadership and about politics. They don't want anything to do with it. They feel that nothing good can come from it, especially nowadays. And I find that this is one of those stories that continues to inspire me and so many folks, including probably many of you viewing tonight, but also something that ends up inspiring students. Insofar as if you could take a time machine and go back and meet Harry Truman when he was this kid on the left part of your screen, you would never, ever expect that he would become anything or anyone. Growing up in rural Missouri, Truman would ultimately be the last American president to lack a college degree. He was not well traveled. In World War II, he rose to the lofty ranks of just captain, Battery D of the Missouri Artillery. He was not particularly, dashing in one way or the other, very average in so many ways. And he also grew up in a family that was descended from slave owners. The Trumans were, in many ways, both sides of the family, unreconstructed Confederates. Family was also known for its bigotry and anti-Semitic views. Yet Harry Truman would grow up to be one of the world's great leaders, and also one of the great champions of not only statehood for Israel, but the larger Jewish diaspora. Who would have thunk it, right, everybody? So just a quick background on this person who's my hero, Harry Truman, and then we'll jump into this. I had the pleasure, starting about 25 years ago or so, of taking, I think it took me about 8-9 years, I tracked down all the living advisors, aides, secretaries, generals, everybody that worked for Truman, and taped their story, sort of like a show-up project, and then, of course, sent them to the Truman Presidential Library. And what emerged was just a real mensch. I mean, a remarkable person, kind, humble as he was in the White House as he was when he was a kid. One story, I found one of his secretaries. Her name was Wanda, and she was here in Florida, on the other side of the state from where I am. So I called her and asked if I could interview her and drove across the state to meet her. She was a little bit nervous, having never done anything like this. So I said, while I'm setting up the camera and we're just going to sit at the table and talk as if we're having lunch, why don't you tell me a story about Harry? And this is what she told me. She said he had a Maine secretary, and then there were a couple of us who were, 20 years old. We were off to the side. So we really never met him. We never worked with him. All we did was answer the phone, type, stuff like that. She said, but Truman had a photographic memory and a heart of gold. He literally cared about everybody, knew everybody that worked for him, their name. He knew something about him. She said one day she brought in a new photograph of her son. I can't remember his name. Let's say it was John, and he's about 2. And she put that photograph of her son on her desk. Truman comes walking by on the other side of the office complex with a gaggle of aides. In the middle of it, he stops and yells across the entire complex. He yells, "Wanda." And she says, I almost fell out of my chair. How would he know my name? And she turned around and said, "Yes, Mr. President," with all eyes on her. And he said, "Is that a new photograph on your desk?" And she said, "Yes." He said, "Well, who is it?" She said, "It's my son." He says, "Does he have a name?" She said, "John." Truman says, "Well, how old's the young man?" She said, 2. And then she said, "Well, he's not 2, but he'll be 2 in another 9 weeks on, July 20th or something." And Truman says, "Well, tell him that Harry said hello." And he laughed and walked into his office. And she said, "I was thinking, that's surreal. Everybody comes up to me. How do you know him?" She says, "I don't. He just knew my name and asked." Well, you know where I'm going with this. 9 weeks later, she said, on the day of her son John's birthday, Truman goes walking into his office, and he stops before he goes into his office and yells across the complex, "Wanda, today's John's birthday. Happy birthday to you." The president of the United States. She said that was Harry Truman, heart of gold, photographic memory, just a remarkable guy. When I go to the Truman Library, or quite frankly, any battlefield, historic site, or library, I try to get to know the archivist and ask them to find for me their favorite letters and documents. Is there one that made you laugh, one that made you cry, etc.? And one archivist at the Truman Library many years ago, probably 25 years ago, pulled this letter for me. It was written by a fella who, Truman's now the former president, living at his home at 219 North Delaware Street in Independence, Missouri. And the guy is down the street and his car breaks down. So he walks down the road and knocks on Truman's door and asks to use his phone to call for a tow truck. My students on campus are shocked to know we didn't have cell phones back then. So Truman lets him use his phone. The man calls and asks for a tow truck. And Truman says to him, "Look, it'll take the tow truck a few minutes. Why don't you have a seat, glass of iced tea?" And they're just shooting the breeze. Eventually, the man says, "Well, you've been more than kind. I should be going." And as he walks out, he said that Truman walked out the front porch, walks down the steps with him. The man has no idea it's Harry Truman. Just stopped at the first house and knocked on the door. He doesn't know who it is. As the man's leaving, he turns around and says, quote unquote, "Has anyone ever told you, you look just like that SOB, Harry Truman?" And Truman laughed and said, "Yeah, I get that all the time." And then Truman waves goodbye, and the man went out and got his tow truck and carpooled. Sometime later, the man realized, oh my goodness, that was Harry Truman. So he wrote this letter to the Truman Library. Another letter that I particularly liked, and then just one more story, and we'll jump into this. There was a young couple that got married, and for a honeymoon, they were sort of doing that, I don't know, Route 66 to drive across the country, Americana. And for whatever the reason, they were driving through Independence, Missouri, and they went to Truman's house. Well, it's no mansion, and of course, back then you didn't have all the Secret Service or the motion detectors and gates and lights and everything. So they stopped and they went up to Harry Truman's house. So doesn't appear to be anybody home. So the woman walks up on the porch, hands the camera to her husband, and he's going to take some pictures of them standing, his wife standing, his new wife standing on the porch. And then she's pretending to open the door like she's going in, and they're taking pictures. She said to her horror, the door opened up, and there stood the president of the United States. And Truman looks at him and says, "Here, give me the camera. Go on in the house. Now pretend you're coming out." And he's taking pictures. He has them sit on his porch and he's walking around. Then he gives them the camera back. and asked where they're going and wherever they were going for the next stop in their tour of Americana. Truman walks out to the street with them and he says, well, you know, you go down to 2nd Street, you turn left, you go about a mile, you know, like your grandpa or something. And they drove away and he's standing there on the road waving. They said they couldn't believe it. That was the president of the United States. So they were so excited to get their film developed. My students have no idea what I'm talking about. So they rushed to get their film developed. They said the problem was, and what we know, those of us that study Truman, is he never took pictures. Truman cuts their head off in almost every picture, but at least they had some great stories to tell. One more, I interviewed a speechwriter to Harry Truman, Dr. Ken Heckler, Hechler, who was a noted professor and worked for FDR and Truman. By the way, one of the first people to interrogate the Nazi high command at the end of the war, including Hermann Goering, the Luftwaffe commander, and at one point the number 2 in Nazi Germany. So Dr. Heckler says at one meeting, you know, the cabinet are sitting around the table, junior aides are sitting around the periphery, which is still the custom. And he was a junior aide, he's a speechwriter. He said some important meeting is going on, and he's just sitting there in the backside taking notes that he could use to maybe help him write a speech about this, should that be the case. He said in the middle of the meeting, Truman stops the meeting and looks at him and says, Ken, are you okay? Ken had a loss, a death in the family, and he was very sad. And he said, Mr. President, I'm fine. And Truman said, no, I can tell there's something wrong. Are you okay? Everything all right? And Dr. Heckler said, you know, this is a presidential cabinet meeting. By all means, sir, please continue. Everything's fine. So he said after the meeting, he goes back to his office. He said sometime later, Truman's secretary came up and handed him a note. It was a note from President Truman saying, I can tell something's bothering you. Why don't you join me for dinner tonight? So he goes into the White House and has dinner with the president of the United States. And Truman wants to know if he's okay. And he tells him what's happened. And Truman was giving him an ear. He said sometime into it, he realized that Truman wasn't really cheering him up. So Truman went over and sat down at the piano, started tickling the ivories. He was a very good pianist. And he's trying to make Dr. Heckler smile. So he's playing the piano and telling him jokes. He told him the following joke. He said, you know, politics is the worst business imaginable. It attracts the worst people. Therefore, almost everything's forgivable or understandable with politicians. He says, but there's something I want to tell you. Never tell my mother I'm in politics because she thinks I play the piano in a brothel. So that was Truman's joke. So that's Harry Truman. So the pictures you're looking at here on the left, that's one of the earliest known photos of Harry. Grows up in rural Missouri. As I said, you heard about his family. They're farmers. Truman, last president, as I said, the lack of college degree, works briefly at a bank, speculates on oil and other things, loses everything, goes bankrupt, was a farmer, worked briefly for the railroads and so on. When Truman was a young boy, he finally finds something he's good at and he likes. He joins the Missouri National Guard. There you can see the image on the right. The problem was the uniforms back then were blue. And the Trumans, as I said, were racists and anti-Semites descended from slave owners. So Truman comes home proud to show his family his uniform. And he says they told him, get out of the house or change the uniform. There was a blue uniform in a Truman home once. That was Reconstruction after the Civil War. That's how bigoted they were. As bad as the Trumans were, he marries into an even more anti-Semitic and bigoted family, the Wallaces, Bess's family. Mama Wallace, as he called her, Madge, was horrific about her bigotry, racism, and anti-Semitism. Truman recalled sitting at the dinner table, and I remember when I was a kid because of sexism, you know, my grandfather always sat at the head of the table, or my father. If I had dared to sit at the head of the table, they would have given me one of those Robert De Niro looks, right? You just get up. But Mama Wallace always sat at the head of the table and wouldn't let Truman do it. She couldn't stand Truman and his politics. Once he said that at dinner, he's on one side, Bess is on the other. He said, Mama Wallace looked at the salt and pepper shaker, looked at him, looked at the salt and pepper shaker, looked at Bess, and then says, quote unquote, Elizabeth, darling, would you have Mr. Truman pass the salt and pepper? She wouldn't even talk to him. He brings her to the White House and says to her, Mama Wallace, tonight you're going to stay in the most famous bedroom in the country, the Lincoln bedroom. She says, I'll have my bags packed and I'll be leaving. He has to find her another bedroom. So that's the sort of family he grows up in. Truman has a dream of being a military officer. He also loves history and architecture. He would get the chance to do both. He would never get to go to West Point because his eyesight was so bad. But he would, older than most other men, enlist in World War I, where he becomes an artillery captain. He was worried about passing the eye exam. So what he does is, he packs an extra pair of glasses in every pocket during the war because he's, darn near blind. The problem is he's not going to be able to pass the eye test. So as he goes in to take the eye test, there's a few other young soldiers there. He tells them, why don't you two go in front of me? And with this photographic memory, he listens and memorizes the whole eye chart. He said, I walked in with no glasses on. I couldn't even see it. And it just went E, F, and he just read the whole, from memory, the whole chart and passed. During the war, Truman becomes quite a hero, serves in the Meuse-Argonne offensive in World War I, which was a bloodbath. World War I becomes important for statehood for Israel later, as Truman sees the evil that men can do up close during the war. He saw men die, and he killed people in the war. So he had a healthy respect for those in uniform, veterans, POWs, as well as the horrors of war. And he would come back a changed man, pledging that the rest of his life he was going to be a champion for those who needed a champion. And that would later play an important role in his decisions vis-a-vis Israel, the displaced persons camps, the larger Jewish diaspora, and so on. Truman would also get the chance to be an architect and an historian. While he's in the White House, the building is ready to fall apart. Truman describes the chandeliers as swaying back and forth when someone would walk upstairs. Remember, this building was burned by the British on August 24th, 1814. There would be later another fire. They added a third floor, and we still have old wood beams on it. So by Truman's presidency, it was ready to fall. He said that the doors wouldn't shut, that the foundation was off kilter. He used to laugh and say the ghosts of other presidents would walk the halls at night. He could hear them creaking and groaning. One day, Truman's trying to get support to rebuild the White House, but he can't get it through the opposition party in Congress. So Truman invites some leaders, as well as the architect of the Capitol and others, to tour the White House to show them the doors and frames are off kilter, the chandeliers swing. And as they're walking through the White House, there's a pile of rubble on the floor. I mean, what's the odds? It looks like it's a construction site. Everybody looks at him and he has no idea. So they all look up, and the leg of his piano was sticking through the ceiling. And he says, gentlemen, this building is standing purely by habit. It's time to renovate it. So they gutted the entire building. When they did that, Truman made sure it was an historically accurate renovation. So he got to play historian and architect, and would add the Truman balcony, which his opponents criticized and called him Back Porch Harry. Truman reminded them that George Washington and Thomas Jefferson loved porches. What's interesting is since then, most presidents have said the Truman balcony provides one of their favorite views of the city from the White House. All right, so statehood for Israel. So in 1948, Truman was picked, as you're all probably aware, in 1944 as FDR's vice president. John Nance Garner, Henry Wallace had been the two previous ones. Truman's his third vice president. In 48, Truman's running to be president on his own. The problem is he's challenged on his political left and political right within his own party. His own party doesn't want to renominate him. Henry Wallace, the friend of the farmer, not George, was running on the left, and Strom Thurmond, the old Dixiecrat Klansman from South Carolina, was running on his right. So it was a three-way race, and they didn't even want to renominate Truman. At the Democratic Convention in 48, they get up and they announce Truman's platform, which included universal health care to thank our veterans and the public for what they sacrificed during World War II, an expansion of Social Security, an expansion of the GI Bill. It also included some of our first programs for African Americans and civil rights programs. Truman wanted a Civil Rights Act, which would have to wait until 1964, the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Truman also wanted statehood for Israel and a massive loan guarantee for the new fledgling state. When Strom Thurmond hears that, he's not happy. Thurmond gets up and walks out of the Democratic Convention when he heard about Truman's programs on civil rights and for the Jewish community. And he takes delegates from southern states out of the convention with him. The fat lady's warming up backstage. It's all over for Harry Truman. When Thurman is walking out, a reporter stops him and would later write about this, so we know the story. The reporter says, Governor, he was governor of South Carolina at the time, Governor Thurman, why are you walking out? And he says, on account of Truman's programs for civil rights and Jews. And those aren't the words he used, of course. And the reporter says to Thurman, well, his platform simply says what FDR's platform always said. Thurman puts his finger in the reporter's chest and says, yeah, but here's the difference. We all knew that FDR would only ever talk about it, but we all know that SOB Truman will actually do it. And he walked out. That night, Truman writes a diary entry, which survives, speaking of these two great issues, a civil rights program, a program for Israel. Truman writes, quote unquote, in doing these, I will lose the White House. So be it. Right thing to do, period. Everybody, that's almost Jimmy Stewart and Mr. Smith goes to Washington, right? I mean, it almost sounds corny today or hokey, doesn't it? Truman was willing to do what was right and lose rather than do what was wrong and win. And everybody, I suspect that was probably the last time a major politician ever did such a thing. So Truman managed to win. Oops, let me get this slide forward here. There we go. So Truman is opposed on Israel from all sides. Truman's aides oppose him. Southerners oppose him. Republicans oppose him. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, the State Department, the British. Truman's darn near alone. What really hurt, however, is one of the men that Truman most admired. That's the great General George Marshall. Marshall was Truman's Secretary of State. Truman used to call him the Great Marshal or the Great One. Said he was basically the reincarnation of George Washington. And Marshall opposes Truman's decision on statehood for Israel, threatening, number one, that he would publicly resign if Truman pushed statehood for Israel and vote against it. Now, I'm happy to tell you Marshall said this not because he was an anti-Semite, but because Marshall said, if you do this and support statehood for Israel, we know the Soviets are going to arm and back the Arabs. You're going to have World War III, and they're going to drive the Jews into the sea, and that's all she wrote. So even the support of Marshall was waning. Truman refuses to accept Marshall's resignation, tells him, here's why I'm doing it. I'm still doing it. You're going to support me, and we're going to do this together. So Truman's darn near alone on this. Aides are resigning, so forth and so on. Still, Truman's mind was made up to promote statehood for Israel. Here you can see May 14th, 1948. That's when Truman signs the proclamation for statehood on Israel at 6:11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on May 14th. And as Art had noted at the beginning, making Truman the first world leader to come out in support of it. Now, the State Department did not want statehood for Israel, so you can see the rather bland language. The United States recognizes the provisional government as the de facto authority, of the Jewish state. Truman crosses that out and writes "State of Israel" with a big bold signature on it. You can read into that. Truman's support for Israel was strong, unwavering. The picture on the left reminds me of a letter Truman gets from the great Dr. Chaim Weizmann, the chemist, Zionist leader, who would become fast friends with Truman. Weizmann writes Truman a letter telling him about the day that May 14th, when Truman recognizes statehood. As you can see in the picture, of course, from New York to Tel Aviv, all around the world, the Jewish community and friends of this new state were celebrating. And Dr. Weizmann is not celebrating. He's in his office frantically writing letters, he says to Truman in this letter, which still survives. Weizmann's aides come busting into the room and say, Dr. Weizmann, what are you doing? Why aren't you celebrating? Haven't you heard? Truman recognized this. It's official. And Weizmann says two things. Number one, I knew he would do it. They said, how did you know? This is what he said. Weizmann says, because when I met with Truman, he shook my hand and gave me his word. Do you imagine, Matt, a day and age when, just a handshake was your bond? I mean, my goodness, we are so far from that these days in our politics. The second thing Weizmann said is, Well, you go and celebrate. He goes, I need to work. He goes, we're a state now. He goes, now the real work begins. You need to get the whole world to work with us. And of course, we're being attacked by 6 of our neighbors. So now the real work begins. Truman, even before statehood, is supportive of the Jewish diaspora, as I've said, the displaced persons. So as you're all probably aware, you have countless thousands, hundreds of thousands of Jews that are in DP camps after the Holocaust and World War II. Many did not want to return home. And who could blame them? If I'm in a camp, I don't think I want to go back to Germany or Poland. And folks, yet they're stuck in the camp. The conditions in the camp were abysmal. We have documentation that folks died in the camp because they weren't getting adequate medicine, food, clothing, and so forth and so on. There were also problems that guards and local Germans in the camp were attacking Jews in the camp and stealing their food and their rations. Having just survived the Holocaust, no one was in a physical condition to fight back. So the situation's deplorable. Moreover, those Jews that do leave the camps, you can see on the bottom right, in ships, from Cyprus and around Europe to head to Palestine and Transjordan, the British Navy's policy was to intercept the ships and tow them back to Cyprus. So the British Navy would even ram the ships if need be. Truman enters in here and really changes things. Number one, Truman tells the British to cease and desist from their policy of intercepting Jews on the way to what would become Israel. Truman knows that one of the keys for statehood is you need a critical number of Jews on the ground there in order for statehood to work. So we need immigrants. So he forces the British to stand down. The British oppose, and Truman reminds the British, he who pays, plays. Truman reminds the British that he's floating them massive loan guarantees for them to rebuild from the war. So he basically strong arms them into it. I'm going to just real quickly cover this. So when the war ends in May, the condition in Europe, the conditions in the camps were just horrible. The Allies, of course, did not have enough food, enough anything for anyone. The fields in Europe were largely fallow during the war. No one's growing in the middle of the war. Sewage systems, water systems, power plants were blown up in the carpet bombing of the continent. So this is the condition. Now, inside the camps, Jews were not allowed to send or receive mail. Could you imagine surviving the Holocaust, not knowing what happened of your hometown, your family and friends, and not being allowed to send or receive mail? We had so few soldiers because we had to redeploy everybody to the Pacific theater to deal with ending the war in the Pacific with the Imperial Japanese. So we decided to use some former German soldiers as the guards in the DP camps. We even had people still wearing the striped uniform from the Holocaust in the camp because there was such a limit of food, clothing, and so on. And with so few DP camps and so many displaced persons, some were still in concentration camps that were being used as DP camps. Who made all these decisions? General George Patton. Patton was an ugly anti-Semite who was nominally in charge of these camps at the end of the war. Truman hears about the state of the camps and is livid. Patton has the following quote shortly before his untimely death in a car accident. Patton says, quote unquote, there you can read it on the screen, others believe that the displaced person is a human being, which he is not. And this applies particularly to the Jews who are lower than animals. So now you can get a sense of why Patton is using German soldiers as guards and mistreating Jewish DPs. So what Truman does is Truman is livid. Truman does two things. One, he removes Patton, which is courageous because Truman's not popular and Patton is revered. Number two, he picks this guy, Earl Harrison, to go over and study the conditions in the DP camps. Earl Harrison looks like he's straight from Central Casting, doesn't he, everybody? He's got the baritone voice, the slick back hair. He's the dean of the law school at the University of Pennsylvania, and an extremely impressive guy. Truman, a lot like Lincoln and George Washington, had a talent for knowing how little he knew. Remember, one of the keys to greatness and leadership is to know what you don't know. Truman knew he didn't know much. So Truman would use his other talent for picking good people. Truman surrounded himself with the best of the best of the best, and he listened. So he picks Harrison, sends Harrison over to study the conditions of the DP camps. Harrison writes back and is appalled at what he finds. He describes everything that I just said. You're looking at a letter that Truman shoots off to General Eisenhower about we need to do a better job with these DP camps. Here's a line from Harrison's report. And you can read this report from 1945. Harrison reports back to Truman, as things stand now, we appear to be treating the Jews as the Nazis treated them, except that we do not exterminate them. They are in concentration camps in large numbers under our military guard instead of SS troops. One is led to wonder whether the German people, seeing this, are not supposing that we are following or at least condoning Nazi policy. Wow, ouch. So what Truman does secondly is he sends Harrison to walk the halls of Congress to get funds. With funding, Truman dispatches that to the DP camps. It's Truman that sends money, food, clothing, blankets, medicine, everything that folks need in the DP camps. He saves countless lives in the camps. He does something else which is controversial. Every once in a while, I'll meet an uninformed scholar who will, snip at this, and I'll say, you have no idea. What Truman did was he segregated Jews from non-Jews in the camps. So every once in a while, someone will say, Truman was an anti-Semite. He segregated Jews in the camps. The reason he did it is Jews in the DP camps were asking to be segregated because they were being attacked, beaten, and their rations stolen by non-Jews in the camps. So by separating the camps, it helped people to live, get their rations, live comfortably. And then the last thing Truman does is he sends rabbis to the camps with mail. So mail can be delivered and all that. The British are not happy about this. Truman butts heads with Attlee on Britain. Truman tells the British, as I said a moment ago, to stand down from the policy of not allowing Jews to get from the DP camps to Palestine. Attlee says he doesn't want a single Jew going there. Truman counters and says we should have a committee that makes a proposal. Truman said, I'll put the committee together, and he stacks it with friends of his, including rabbis. The committee recommends 100,000 Jews immediately go to Palestine, and then more after that. Attlee and the British diplomats counter and say 1,500. Truman says, you mean 1,500 a month? And Attlee starts squabbling. Truman says, I'm done with you. We're going to send as many as we can. So Truman even pushes our allies, the British, on this. So that's the background. So Truman is hell-bent on statehood for Israel. He's lining up the loan guarantees. He's lining up all the support. He's improved the conditions in the DP camps. He's greased the wheels in Congress. He has General George Marshall on a short leash. The State Department, the Pentagon opposed him. He had them muzzled. He's ready to go. So on the eve of statehood, Truman calls a meeting with some of the most important rabbis in the country. You all probably recognize these guys. That's Abba Hillel Silver on the left from Ohio, and Rabbi Stephen Wise on the right from New York. Perhaps the two most famous rabbis of the time. So Truman calls a meeting with rabbis, and the purpose of the meeting is not to debate statehood for Israel. Rather, it's a courtesy call. Truman meets with the rabbis and says, my mind's been made up. I've greased all the wheels. I have get this, everyone, a loan guarantee for Israel, $100 million. After World War II, with the American public opposed to it, with Congress opposed to it, Truman's going to float a $100 million loan guarantee to the new fledgling state. Truman says to the assembled group of rabbis, I wanted you to be the first to hear it, so you can go tell your congregations what we're going to do. I don't want you and your flock to read this in the paper. I went from my lips to you, from you to them. So that's a pretty thoughtful thing he does. But Silver almost ruins everything. Now, Silver's brilliant. Silver's a great orator. I even had the opportunity to go to his synagogue twice in Ohio and speak from the Bema. And And Silver was the bad guy in this story. I kept expecting a lightning bolt to come down and blow me off the bema, but it didn't. At any rate, so Silver starts accusing Truman, saying, "You're lying to us. I know you're not going to do this. I've heard that you're an anti-Semite, as is your family." Truman says, "What part of yes did you not hear?" And I said, "Yes, I'm going to support statehood. I have the loan guarantee. Everything's ready to go." Silver then starts complaining. Silver's view is Truman should have come to him rather than him being summoned to Truman. Truman's the president of the United States. That's what a megalomaniac Silver is. Then Silver does the unforgivable. He starts pounding his fists on Truman's desk, and they start screaming at one another. Truman finally erupts and says, quote unquote, "No one," and I mean no one, pounds their fists on the desk of the president of the United States. "You can get the hell out of my office." And then he throws everybody out of his office. Now, Truman does the following. If we didn't know the ending of the story and all that Truman did, this would be more, bothersome. But because we know the ending, Truman throws all the rabbis, everybody out of his office. Then he issues his "no more rabbis allowed" decree. He goes, he's not going to change his mind on Israel. He says, "I'm getting it from the State Department. I'm getting it from the British. I'm getting it from the South. I'm getting it from my wife." He says, "Now I'm getting it from the people I'm trying to help." Truman says, "I can't put up with it anymore. No more rabbis allowed. I'm still going to support statehood and do everything, but I'm not talking to anybody." The hero in the story is Rabbi Stephen Wise. Stephen Wise was in the meeting. Now, what happens is Silver goes out of the meeting. The media put a microphone in his face, and Silver says, "Truman just threw me out of his office. He's an anti-Semite." Silver goes on a lecture tour. Mind you, he's a brilliant orator, charismatic. Silver goes on a lecture tour bad-mouthing Harry Truman. He is single-handedly undermining this on the eve of statehood. But Wise was in the meeting. So Stephen Wise, by the way, these two guys never got along, Silver and Wise. Wise was, he says to rabbis, he goes, no, don't listen to Silver. I was in the meeting. I believe Truman. He's with us. It was Silver who was a megalomaniac. So Wise says, well, what we need to do is reassure the Zionist community and the Jewish community. He says, I remember hearing that Harry Truman's best friend was a Jew. That's Eddie Jacobson, who was his World War I buddy and his haberdashery partner in his business after the war. So Wise goes to find Eddie Jacobson and asks Eddie to intervene with Harry. Eddie, would you please be willing? Here's a picture of Eddie and Harry. Eddie, would you be willing to go see Truman and tell him to reconsider? And please meet with Dr. Weizmann. There's Eddie on the left and Harry on the right. They served in World War I together. They ran a canteen, a little supply shop that actually made money for all the soldiers, like a co-op, if you will. And like many men during the war, they said, if we live through this war, let's open up a little haberdashery. They did, and it went out of business. Harry was 7 years older than Eddie, more the big brother. Harry covered Eddie's debts to help him out. So they were fast friends, best buddies. Eddie agrees to go see Truman and ask Truman to meet with Dr. Weizmann. Now, as you can see, it's central to the story. Eddie is follically challenged. So Eddie goes to see Harry, and he gets out about 4 lines. He says, you've got to meet with Dr. Weizmann. He's a great man, an old man, and he's in New York. He spent his whole life wanting statehood for Israel, and then Eddie starts to cry. Harry throws his arm around Eddie's shoulders as the big brother and says, quote unquote, all right, you bald-headed SOB, I'll meet with him. So Truman meets with Dr. Weizmann. Now, when they meet, it's an icy cold meeting. Weizmann has heard from Silver that Truman's an anti-Semite, and he's really not going to do all that he said he was going to do. Meanwhile, Truman thinks Weizmann's going to come in and yell at him and criticize him the way Silver did. Truman also doesn't want the other rabbis to know that he's meeting with Weizmann, so he kind of sneaks him in through the back door. Weizmann thinks he's coming in through the back door because he's a Jew. Truman doesn't want the media to cover it because he's worried that Weizmann will criticize him, and he says, I'm going to lose the election as is. So it's a quiet meeting. Weizmann is reading off the credentials, Dr. Chaim Weizmann, Zionist, chemist, yada, 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 does present himself to President Harry Truman. Weizmann realizes Truman's bored and not paying attention. And then a couple of things happen to cement their friendship. Weizmann says, let's stop the proceedings. And he gives Truman the Torah. You can see Truman holding the scroll right there in the picture. He presents Truman with the Torah. Truman says, quote unquote, thanks for the thing. I've always wanted one of these. And then Weizmann in horror looks at Truman, and Truman winks and starts laughing. Weizmann laughs. Then Truman seals the deal by telling him, let's just cut the crap. Why don't you and I go in the back room and talk about statehood? But in Truman's Midwest Missouri drawl, he cannot pronounce C-H-A-I-M, Chaim. Truman calls him Cham. And Weizmann's going, Truman's going, Cham. And they both start laughing. And that's when someone took the picture here. They go into the back room. Neither man wrote about what they said, but here's what we know. When they came out, they were arm in arm and fast friends. Weizmann would later say that he recognized that Truman was with us. He was one of us, he would say. It was Weizmann, with his stature, gravitas. It was Weizmann that went to Silver and said, zip it, Truman's with us. And Weizmann then reassured the Zionist community. The two of them would become fast friends. By the way, Weizmann at one point writes Truman a series of letters, and I've had the great opportunity of wearing gloves and holding the letters and reading them. And one of them, he teases Truman in reference to Silver and some rabbis giving Truman a rough time. Weizmann says to Truman, I don't know if you know this or not, but I'm a much more important leader than you are. While you're the leader of 150 million people, and I'm only the leader of a couple 100,000, I'm the leader of a couple 100,000 who all think they're the leader. So he plays with that with Harry Truman. Then he sends Weizmann sends Truman a really thoughtful letter. He says to him, and I asked when I interviewed two of Truman's aides once, one senior, one junior, I asked them, did you ever see Harry Truman cry? And they both whispered, and then they said yes. And this is the story they told me. He cried when he got a letter from Weizmann. They said, in a letter, Weizmann said to Truman, quote unquote, generations of Jewish children yet unborn will call you father. And they said Truman cried when he read the letter. Here's Truman reading with David Ben-Gurion and Abba Eban. So while Weizmann becomes like a brother to Truman, Eban considers Truman a father figure. Abba Eban, when he's Israel's ambassador to the world at this period in time, he's only 33 years old. He's sent around the world by Weizmann and others to say, you have the most difficult job in the world. You got to make the world like us and work with us, deal with us. Truman got the vote, but that doesn't mean everything's greased. So Eban is nervous about meeting Truman. Weizmann tells Eban, remember, Truman is more important than all the other world leaders together. Here's the second thing Weizmann tells Eban. I also want you to, when you meet with Truman, I want you to remember this. You're not meeting with Harry Truman. You're meeting with Moses. So Eban meets with Truman, and he's looking for just the right thing to do. Eban is inspired by a story he hears. Here's the story that he hears, which he later would write about. The British diplomats try to undermine statehood. So what they do is they and the American diplomats call a meeting with Truman. It's not on Truman's calendar, it's impromptu. Truman's asked to quick come in. Truman thinks he's just going to come in and shake hands, press the flesh. The British and the Americans jump Truman, and here's the tone of the meeting. They use words like this. You need to remember that you are one of us. The Jews are one of them. They have their priorities. We have ours. They're trying to talk Truman out of statehood on the eve of it. After they finish, Truman says, sit down. Now it's my turn. He says, when I am, wedded to a concept, he goes, I'm cemented. I am immovable. I'm doing this. And then Truman rattles off a couple 1,000-year history. Abraham, Jacob, Isaac, Noah, Moses, with dates and details. He rattles off a couple 1,000-year history of the plight of the Jewish people, ending with the following, saying, I know all about the persecution, and I know about the promise, and we're going to make that happen. Then he throws the British and American diplomats out of his office. Get the hell out of my office. Then Truman wrote a one-sentence memorandum. Matthew, I'm going to ask for your forgiveness up front. I'm going to quote verbatim. Truman was so mad at the diplomatic corps, the State Department, for trying to undermine statehood to Israel, he sent his advisors a one-sentence memo. This is what it said. I held it in my hand. He said, quote unquote, never trust the goddamn sons of bitches in the State Department. Harry S. Truman. That's what he said. He was so mad at them. But Eben meets with Truman. Eben hears that story. He's so inspired by the fact that Truman, off the top of his head, remember the meeting was not planned. Off the top of his head, Truman knew a couple thousand-year history of names, dates, details. So when Eben goes to meet Truman, he hears that Truman is a fan of Cyrus the Great, the first to bring Jews back to Jerusalem, right? Not Xerxes or some of the other crazy Persian leaders, Darius, but Cyrus. So when Eben goes to meet with Truman, this is what he says to him. Talk about a way to introduce yourself to someone. He says, Mr. President, he goes, my country is brand new, young, a small country the size of New Jersey. We don't have great wealth or treasures. We can't bestow upon you titles and gold and banners and honors. He said, but what we can do, he said, the people of my country, their names, my people rather, I'm sorry, my people, the Jewish people, their names will never be forgotten from history. He says, so to the list of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Noah, Moses, we add the name Truman. Mr. President, we thank you and give you immortality. Wow. Then he bows and calls Truman the American Cyrus. He knew Truman would get the reference, what, 5th century BCE. Truman pats Abba Eben on the arm and says, nah, it's just Harry. And the two of them become fast friends and work together. So bringing this thing to a close, it's two things. One, how do you explain Truman's change of heart? How did a kid that grew up in rural Missouri, lacked a college degree, from a family of anti-Semitic, racist, former slave owners, how did he put his presidency on the line in 48 for this? A couple things. Number one, when he was a boy, he was a Shabbos Goy. Truman knew almost every Jewish family in the town, which were only a few. His best friend was Eddie Jacobson there, you can see on the left. And Truman also had several close Jewish friends. Historians believe that the best man in Truman's wedding was a Jew who had changed the name from M-A-R-X to M-A-R-K-S to hide his identity. So Truman had close relationships with a lot of Jews who changed his heart. Eddie Jacobson there on the left tells us a story. He and Harry, they were naming a Hallel after Eddie, and Eddie asked Harry to go along with him. Harry said, I wouldn't miss it. So they go there, and Eddie says, when they call Eddie up on stage and are thanking him for all that he did, and they give him this certificate, and we're naming it after you. Eddie said he looked in the back of the room and Truman was crying. So that's how much he cared about all this. Secondly, Truman was in the military. There he is, Captain Harry. And as I said a moment ago, he saw men die, he killed people. So when he came back from the war, he was a much more mature person who realized the horrors of war and the evils of humanity, vowed to always help the underdog. Third reason for Truman's change of heart, he was a voracious reader with a photographic memory who loved the Old Testament. He was something of an agnostic, but he loved the Old Testament, and he loved the sweeping stories of the Hebrew people and so forth. He knew them. And I would add a fourth reason, which you can't really quantify. The other ones Truman wrote about. I just think that Truman had a moral compass, everybody. You know, when FDR made decisions, he made them like a chess player moving pieces around. Everybody was expendable. When Truman made a decision, he reached deep down inside himself, grabbed a hold of his conscience, and didn't let go. It was simply, as he would always say, statehood for Israel, everyone, was simply the right thing to do. In closing, you can see Truman was as early as 43, he's advocating statehood. I just want to give you a baker's dozen, you can read them, but just to say what Truman did. Truman floated a $100 million loan guarantee. Truman promoted immigration exchanges. Truman promoted cultural exchanges. So scholars and museum exhibits, orchestras, all that would bond the friendship between the US and Israel. Truman promised to veto anti-Israel measures in the UN, and he did. Truman protected Israeli copyrights, patents, and trademarks in international courts. Truman set up joint military training, joint intelligence sharing, and Truman, and remember in 1948-49, no one in the world would sell to nor buy from Israel. Their economy was thin ice. Truman basically gives Israel what today we would call most favored nation status, so that Israeli products are selling here. Truman goes through there. You can see the list of all that Truman did. And we finished the baker's dozen. So Truman becomes a true champion. And who would have thunk it, right? The last president to lack a college degree. I'm going to skip all this opposition. Last president to lack a college degree, raised in rural Missouri. So I think it goes to show you that just when we think things can't get any worse, along comes the right person. And you should never stop talking to folks. You know, we sometimes, I suspect, and I looked up all the great work of the Haberman Institute, remarkable work. But I suspect we have a friendly audience and that this audience probably knows all this. We all need to continue to reach out and talk to everybody. Who would have thought that little Harry Truman would grow up to be of someone who would risk his presidency, and yet you can do the right thing and still win, as Truman did in 1948. And that's the behind the scenes story of statehood for Israel in 1948. Thank you, everyone. Happy
Thank
to
you.
take questions. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Watson, for sharing such a fascinating insights into Truman and the formation of the state of Israel. The Q&A button there, you can begin looking at the questions, and for all of you in the audience, please go ahead now and enter questions in. And
Okay.
I see Art also has his hand up. If
Will do. I see a couple here. I'm going to try to click through the first few. I'm going to write them down in case if I lose it here. Clark Clifford and Eddie's role, Margaret, arms embargo. Okay, got it. Okay, so here we go. So Clark Clifford, yeah, the lawyer, everybody remembers Clark Clifford, the great lawyer. He plays an important role. Here's the way Truman would make a decision, everybody. And boy, would I have loved Matt and Art, all of us would probably have loved to have been a fly on the wall for this. What Truman would do is he would, Truman, unlike, let's say, LBJ or Nixon, Truman would not fire you if you disagreed with him. He would get rid of you if you did not disagree with him. He would tell his aides, and I interviewed over a many-year period, I interviewed all these aides who would tell me, Truman would always tell them, you're supposed to disagree with me. In fact, that's not a request, it's an order from your commander. So they'd go around a room and everybody would have to have skin in the game and say, what's your position on, let's say, statehood? Then Truman would pick two advisors ahead of time to get up, and one would debate the pro, one would debate the con. Clark Clifford had the pro, George Marshall had the con. Boy, clash of titans, right, everybody? At the end of it, Truman would sit poker-faced. What we find from Truman's personal letters is even before the debate, he was supporting statehood for Israel. But he still went through the process and had his poker face. Clark Clifford believes that he loses to George Marshall. As Truman then told everybody, you can leave my office, Clifford came back in begging Truman, please don't let my poor performance in the debate affect you, worried that Truman wasn't going to do it. So Clark Clifford's heart was all in. Clifford was 100% behind Truman on statehood for Israel and would be one of Truman, along with a guy named George Elsey, one of his point people on all the details for statehood for Israel. Good question. Number two, Margaret Truman denied the role that Eddie Jacobson played. So I will say this, Margaret, Truman's only daughter, was a grump, and Margaret denies everything. She's crusty and grumbly with everything. And I say that with all due respect because I love Harry, and I'm very good friends with Margaret and his oldest son, Harry's oldest grandson, Clifton, Truman Daniel. Clifton and I have been buddies for a long, long time, 25 years. But at any rate, Margaret was a grump. I tried to get, Clifton and I would do annual Truman programs all the time. We tried to get Margaret to come to them. Went to her house in Manhattan. She had the welcome mat. Her welcome mat said, go away. So we couldn't get her. So the role of Eddie, it's complicated. Did Eddie Jacobson have a close friendship with Harry? Yes, best friends. Was Eddie supportive of statehood? Yes. Did Eddie's responsible for bringing Harry together with Weizmann, Eben, Ben-Gurion. And those friendships would help to make all this a reality. But here's where Margaret is correct. Sometimes you hear people say Truman was against statehood until Eddie talked him into it. No. Truman never changed his mind. He was absolutely wedded to statehood. Eddie came in and just greased the wheels and made possible the meetings with the other, with Weizmann and others. Why did Truman put an arms embargo on Israel during the War of Independence? Great question. So this question is personally one that bothers me in the following way. I got a chance to meet Nancy Spielberg, Steven Spielberg's sister, who put together a great film on the Israeli Air Force. And I have a book on the Holocaust. I took my book and gave it to Nancy, hoping that she or her brother would make it into a movie. But I had to open my big mouth and told Nancy Spielberg, I love your movie, but you made a huge mistake in it. She criticizes Truman for the arms embargo. And I said, you're wrong on that. Here's why. Weizmann and Eben asked Harry Truman for 10 things: immigration exchanges, cultural exchanges, loan guarantees, 100 million, vetoes in the UN, joint military training, intelligence sharing, blah, 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 blah. Truman delivered 9 out of 10. The only one he didn't deliver was direct arms, airplanes and direct arms. Why? Because when Truman got the world, the UN, to vote for statehood, and the vote was something like 32 for, 13 against, 13 abstention. When Truman got the world to vote, the deal was the United States would not provide direct arms. When Truman got the $100 million loan guarantee and support through Congress, the deal from Congress was you cannot provide direct armaments. So Truman delivered 9 out of 10, not the arms. But Truman has letters, and I've read them, held them with Weizmann and Eben, where he says, look, I can't deliver this. I can deliver 9 out of 10. Would you like me to try to deliver arms? But if I do, I can't do the $100 million loan guarantee. They told him, heck no, we want the 100 million. That's what they wanted. So then Truman writes him a letter back and basically says, use the 100 million as you see fit. Wink, wink. So in other words, Truman looked the other way, as that money was used for what? To buy weapons from former Czechoslovakia, former Soviet satellite the countries that would be under the Soviet control, etc. So Truman actually looked the other way. There's another interesting memo that the State Department contacts Truman and says, we have evidence that American Jews are sending arms and money to Israel for the war, the defense, in violation of the agreements. And Truman says, wow, you're right. This is very important. The State Department says, we need to do something now. Truman says, you're right. This is so important that I'm going to take this away from the State Department, and the executive office of the president is going to make this a priority. Then he writes to Weizmann and says, I put that letter in my desk and locked it. In other words, what he did was ran interference. So he could not provide the direct arms. So 9 out of 10. Why were the British so opposed to the establishment of statehood? Yeah, never understood it. Churchill was supportive, everyone. We need to remember much of the world was against it. The British, under the original mandate, the British were favoring a UN trusteeship, which would never been doable and workable. And no one on this call, no one on the Zoom program would want that to happen. So the British were upset because of that. They also saw the potential for World War III, and the British didn't want anything more to do with Palestine. They had their hands full with colonies around the world, and themselves, their country had been destroyed. How did he get along with Bess after his transformation? Did she change too, or remain anti-Semitic? No, Bess never changed. A lot of Truman scholars don't want to say this, but I will say that Bess's mother was brutally anti-Semitic, and I think Bess was too. Love is blind, everyone. I'm a professor of history, so I don't know anything about these kind of relationships. Men are from what, Venus or Mars or whatever that book is. I don't know. Harry loved Bess wildly, even though they were polar opposites in many ways. Where they were the same is they lacked the vices of so many people. They didn't cheat, they didn't run around, they weren't partiers. They were early to bed, early to rise, hard workers. Bess was religious and loved the daughters of the American Revolution and the church ladies. Harry hated going to church. One of his mottos was never trust a Southern Baptist. So they did have things that they really disagreed on. Bess, here's a good story for you. The home that they had at 219 North Delaware Street was given to them by Harry's mother-in-law, Mrs. Wallace. And when she gave the Trumans the keys to the home, she said there's 2 conditions. No Jew, no black will ever step foot in it. And those aren't the words she used. At some point, Truman writes back, and the letter survives, telling Bess he wanted to bring his best friend Eddie over and others Hasn't it been long enough, Truman said. And Best wrote back, no, we have to live in this town. There was one moment, there was a group of Israeli dignitaries, including a young Moshe Dayan, several IDF generals, members of the Knesset, and they're touring the United States. Truman is now the ex-president, and they're visiting military bases, key senators, all to bond the two nations' relationship together. The highlight of their cross-country tour was they're going to go meet Harry Truman. They're going to go meet Moses. And Eddie Jacobson is helping to organize the trip, as is Rabbi Weiss, right before the deaths. And right before they go to see Harry, they call, and Harry says, you can't come over, I'm sick. Wait a little while. And they're thinking, Mr. President, this is a group of dignitaries from Israel. You're the highlight of the trip. What happened was that day at church, it was bring your husband. So Bess told Harry he's coming. And Harry says, I'm sick. I can't go to church. But Bess stayed home to make him soup. He's like, get out of the house. I'm okay. I'm okay. When he finally got her out of the house, he calls and says, bring everybody over. The Israeli dignitaries that were there said it was a remarkable meeting, that Truman regaled them with stories of statehood. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. There was camaraderie, honor, respect, brotherhood. They said, but the whole time he talked, they kept looking at his watch, telling him the boss will be home soon. And boy, is she going to be mad. So here's someone who's willing to risk his presidency, as he did clearly in 48. Remember, statehood for Israel was enormously unpopular. And for Truman to win the presidency in 48, Dewey would take the North. Truman needed to win the South and the Bible Belt. And support for Israel is going to end any support for Truman in the Bible Belt back then and in the South. So he was willing to risk his presidency, but couldn't stand up to his wife. I think that's called marriage. How does Truman rate in the list of presidents in our country? I'm delighted to tell you, Truman rates very highly. The first presidential ranking poll was in 1948 by the great Arthur Schlesinger Sr., the Harvard historian. He got 38 of the nation's leading historians to put their presidents in categories like great, near great, all the way down, yada, 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 to failure. Now, every couple of years, the White House Historical Association, C-SPAN, and others get a small group of leading historians to rank the presidents, McCullough, Doris Kearns Goodwin, Meekum, all these wonderful, Gordon Wood. I'm honored, delighted, lucky, I don't know the word, but I'm one of the couple people that they picked to rank them. I'm happy to say the main presidential ranking poll was in the year 2000 by C-SPAN. Harry was number 5, everybody, number 5, behind Lincoln, Washington, both Roosevelts, and then Harry. He's always between about 5 and about 8. So he's considered a great or near great. And yet the kicker is when he left office, he was down here. He's considered a failure, considered to be one of the worst presidents of the 20th century. Mind you, Hoover, Harding, and Coolidge were in the 20th century. Truman was briefly a Klansman, Rabbi Hirsch. That was pretty common in the area back then, if that's accurate for how long. He was not in the Klan. That's one of those urban legends that's gotten out there. Truman knew people in the Klan. Truman worked for boss Pendergast, who was basically the mob boss in the area. So he had some unsavory ties as a young man. He came back from the war looking for work. Truman goes to a Klan meeting. That's where I think the urban legends started. Not a meeting. He met with several Klan leaders. They came to him because they were angry with what he was doing. Where Truman read them the riot act about being bigots and racists and then threw him out of his office. But he did meet with them. I have one where there's some members of the Jewish community who supported the creation of Israel, and there were some who were against creation of Israel. There's diversity, there's strength and diversity of opinion. The Zionist movement was always split. Theodor Herzl represented one wing, right, everyone? Rabbi Wise and Rabbi Silver had very different views on the role of Israel and so on. Theodor Herzl was very secular at one point, remarkably secular as a young journalist growing up in Budapest and Vienna, who was pretty much against this, but he had a sort of a midlife conversion, and it was the Dreyfus affair. Everybody remembers Captain Alfred Dreyfus, who was railroaded in the 1890s. Herzl was covering that in Paris for his newspaper, and he was shocked, appalled at the degree of anti-Semitic hate and how that trial was basically such a farce. The military tribunal that convicted Captain Dreyfus for giving secrets to the Germans. By the way, he didn't. He was later found innocent. Here was the tautological, the circular, tautological argument of the military tribunal. They said there is no evidence because Dreyfus must have destroyed it, ergo he's guilty. I mean, that's what it was. So James Forrestal and his anti-Semitism. Truman had a good cabinet. Marshall, as I said, Morgenthau stayed briefly, and so on. But there were anti-Semites in the cabinet. There were anti-Semites in the State Department under FDR, under Truman, under Eisenhower. We need to just look back at the American history and realize how high placed a lot of these folks were. Everybody should remember that in the 20s and 30s, probably the three most beloved Americans were brutal anti-Semites. Henry Ford was a vicious anti-Semite. Hitler gave the highest Iron Cross award to only three people, Mussolini, Franco, and Henry Ford. Henry Ford took it. Henry Ford bought the Dearborn newspaper and devoted over 90 issues to blaming Jews for everything under the sun. Henry Ford's the one who introduced that vicious book of conspiracies, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. He introduced it to the United States. This is a book that says there's a 2,000-year plot by Jews to take over the world. And it's utterly discredited. It's nothing but insane conspiracy theories. Yet the QAnon Proud Boy type groups today, believe in all that nonsense. Henry Ford's the one who used his own fortune to print 500,000 copies of that book in English. And when you bought one of his cars, there was a free copy sitting in the passenger seat. Probably the second most beloved American in the 20s and 30s was Lucky Lindbergh. Charles Lindbergh was an anti-Semite. Probably the third most beloved American was Father Charles Coughlin, the anti-Semitic radio priest in the Midwest, right, everybody? Coughlin had over 30 million listeners. Back then, prominent media outlets would love to be, would love to have that kind of listenership or viewership these days. And yet Coughlin raised money to arm what he called America First groups all around the country so that they'd be ready to kill Jews and immigrants if need be. So yeah, there were high-placed anti-Semites throughout the U.S. government, I think up until relatively recently, quite frankly. So thanks, Rabbi Rudin. Jack Goldstein has a question. I looked out at the Truman home. Good one, Jack. That's funny. Yeah, Truman knew what Bess was going to. She was meeting with the, I think it was the Daughters of the American Revolution. They had a brunch where you bring your husband. Truman knew how long it lasted, so he kept his eye on his watch, Jack. And the Israeli dignitaries that were there said it was a magical meeting. Everybody was crying. Truman was happy. There were hugs all the way around, but he told them, boys, you got to hit the road because the boss is coming home soon. And so I just, again, I don't understand those sorts of things, but Harry and Bess were wild about one another. It was the only girl he ever kissed, he said. It was the love of his life. Why? I have no idea. But he was wild about her. But I'll tell you what, and I'll end with this to Jack and everyone. What is, without question, is Truman's support for statehood for Israel as we celebrate it and commemorate it today? Without question. Truman was a pack rat who saved almost everything. Truman was a prolific writer. He journaled, he wrote letters, kept a diary, and he kept everything. Truman wrote a lot of letters from the war, so we know a lot about Truman. Historians love to read Harry Truman the same way they like to read Hamilton and Grant, because those three guys just were incapable of lying. So Truman tells us who he likes, who he doesn't like, what he did right, what mistakes he made. But if you read, as I have, I've spent an adult lifetime pouring through the Truman letters. I am 100% here to tell you that his commitment to immigration and so on is 100%. I'll give you one example, and then Art as a closing question. I interviewed two of Truman's advisors for that project I was doing, and I asked them about, I need a powerful story. And they told me when Truman left office on January 20th, 1953, his approval was in the toilet. The very first public opinion approval poll taken by Mr. Gallup, George Gallup, was in 1933. From there until today, the president with the lowest approval was Truman at 22, 23%. So when Truman was leaving office, there was no fanfare. Eisenhower stiffed Truman and sat out in the car rather than come into the White House for tea, scones, and a tour. And everybody was good riddance. Newspapers wrote, "To air is Truman. Harry who? Question mark." So Truman was head hung low. His aides told me that they were walking him out as he was leaving, carrying his own suitcase. They were trying to cheer him up. They said, "Mr. President, the Marshall Plan saved Western civilization. You know, Mr. President, the Berlin airlift saved the people of that great city. Mr. President, you were the first to push civil rights, women's rights. Mr. President, statehood for Israel. Mr. President, you pushed healthcare, expanded Social Security." You know, and they said he was just like, yeah, just all mopey. But then they said, "Mr. President, hundreds of thousands of DPs, displaced Jews, from the DP camps were saved because of you." And Truman says to them, they said he finally stopped and looked at him and said, "How many did we get out?" And they gave him the number, hundreds of thousands. And they said, Truman shook his head and said, "That's not enough. We could have done more. I should have done more." The answer is no, he couldn't. Here's why. We had immigration quotas. That's for another lecture. And during the 12 years that Hitler was in office, that FDR was in office, we only filled our immigration quota from Germany once. There were seats open, everybody. The problem for Truman is he wants to bring Jews into the country at the end of the war, but Jews in the DP camps won't go back to Poland or Czechoslovakia, so they can't come in under their quota. They're stateless. There's no quotas for the camp, so we can't bring anyone in. So a senior aide named George Elsey told me this is what Truman told his aides to do. He said, find every country that hasn't filled their quotas. Let's say Nigeria and Greece didn't fill their quotas. He said Truman would tell them, "I heard there's a lot of Jews from Nigeria and Greece." They were fibbing the documents, fudging, altering the papers to change people's spelling and bring someone Jewish from the Cyprus DP camp in saying that they were Nigerian or something. So all the immigration papers were fudged. So that gives you some sense of his commitment to it. I'm sorry, Art, you were very patient.
I did, but you ended so well. I hesitate to bring it back to a question, but a quick one. One of the things that Truman was a Freemason. He was very active in the Freemasons, and in his activity, there were a lot of Jewish Freemasons in Missouri when he was a Freemason. One of those was my childhood rabbi, Samuel Thurman.
No.
Was the rabbi who gave the first rabbi to give an invocation at a presidential inauguration. And I know there was correspondence between the two of them before the statehood day for Israel. I just wondered if you have any information about that.
Yeah, so Truman grew up in rural Missouri, everyone. Rural Missouri, a farm. And yet he had a lot of Jewish friends. My joke with the Truman Library people is I think he went around looking for someone that was Jewish to be a friend because I was a Shabbos Goy, so he knew the community. Best man at his wedding. His best friend was Eddie Jacobson. As president, Truman's one of his main speechwriters was Milton Cale, who was Jewish. Judge Sam Rosenman, the great Judge Rosenman, was one of Truman's closest policy confidants. So he has a remarkable array of Jewish advisors around him, as well as you're right, Art, his work as a Mason. Truman was not just a Mason. He was like George Washington. He was all in. He rose up to one of the highest levels of the Masonic order. He went to the meetings, and there were a number of Jewish Masons with whom Truman broke bread. They didn't come to his house because his mother-in-law wouldn't allow it, and his wife would, but he went to their homes and so forth and so on. So through his Masonic connections, it even further expanded what is a remarkably robust array of Jewish confidants, friends, advisors in Truman's orbit, given where he was from, given that it was in the 30s and 40s when he's in his political career. In fact, you'll like this one, Art. Truman was a captain, as I said, Battery D, the Missouri Artillery. Eddie Jacobson was his supply sergeant and his best friend. Truman was called disparagingly Captain Harry Trumanheimer because every single sergeant in his unit was a Jew, to give you some sense of some Masons. So yeah, thanks everybody. I appreciate the opportunity on this very touching and important day.
Thank you again, Professor Watson. This was truly an engaging and informative lecture with so many fascinating narratives and layers to it. So I know everybody in our audience really appreciates all that you brought this evening. And so thank you. And thank you all out there for joining us.
Thanks, everyone. And Matthew, thank you for all that you and the Institute does. I looked you up and it's impressive, the array of programming. So thank you for what you do.